Russia moves nuclear warheads to Belarus. The West says there's no indication that they plan to use them, but Russia says they will if their territory is threatened. Meanwhile, a delegation of African leaders traveled to Russia and Ukraine on their own peace mission, but left mostly empty-handed. Well into its second year, is there anything that can stop the escalation of this war? I'm Andrei Sannikov, and this is The Newsmakers. Russian President Vladimir Putin says that putting tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus is a warning to the West. In March, a plan was announced to move weapons across the border to Russia's closest ally. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said the weapons began arriving last month, and some are 3 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The United States has criticized Putin's decision, calling it irresponsible. But the Russian leader says this is only the beginning.
We will transfer part of this tactical nuclear weapon to Belarusian territory. It happened. The first nuclear charges were delivered to the territory of Belarus, but only the first part. By the end of the summer, by the end of the year, we will fully complete this work. But this is just an element of deterrence, so that everyone who is thinking about inflicting a strategic defeat on us should not forget about this circumstance.
But despite the rhetoric and movement of the nuclear warheads, the U.S. says there's no reason for concern just yet.
We'll continue to monitor the situation very closely and very carefully. We have no reason to adjust our own nuclear posture. We don't see any indications that Russia is preparing to use a nuclear weapon. President said again this week that we remain committed to the defense of NATO, every inch of its territory. So that is our North Star, and we're very focused on that.
Well, the weapons transfer is just one of many moving parts in this war. In Ukraine, residents are still struggling amid flooding and power outages following the Kakhovka Dam collapse. And it's unclear how successful Kiev's counteroffensive is, as both sides make different claims. And it's against this backdrop that a delegation of African leaders traveled to Russia and Ukraine. The mission to Ukraine, the first of its kind by African leaders, comes in the wake of another peace initiative, but carries particular significance for Africa. The continent relies on food and fertilizer deliveries from both countries and has been significantly impacted by the war. But Putin blames the West for Africa's problems now, saying they are responsible for the sharp rise in global food prices early last year that hit Africa especially hard. While both Ukraine and Russia indicated a peace plan put forward by African leaders was unworkable, South Africa's president says it's the beginning of a broader dialogue.
Well, I think our mission was impactful. Its real success obviously will be measured on the ultimate objective of stopping the war. But the impact that it has had is that, one, we were listened to as we gave an African perspective on the war that's having negative consequences for our continent.
So despite various efforts to de-escalate this conflict, the destruction continues, the death toll rises, and now Belarus is hosting Russian nuclear weapons meant to intimidate the West. Well, joining me now to debate the Belarusian position in this are from Minsk, Yauheni Preiherman. He is the director of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations. From Warsaw is Belarusian opposition leader Andrei Sannikov. He headed the Belarusian delegation on nuclear and conventional weapons armament negotiations in the 1990s. And from Cambridge, Paul Ingram, a senior research associate at Cambridge University's Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Thanks all so much for being with us. So, the U.S. says not to worry yet. Russia says this is your warning, and more importantly, that nuclear weapons would only be used if Russia's territory is threatened. Paul, that's about as vague as a threat can get, given Moscow could define just about anything in this war as threatening its territory.
Yeah, so this is standard practice for any nuclear weapon state engaged in nuclear deterrence. It's to have as much ambiguity as it can get away with, to intimidate any adversaries, and to send a very strong signal that under certain circumstances it is willing to use nuclear weapons. We often have a problem with any time Putin opens his mouth and talks about nuclear weapons, and I understand that this is a really serious issue, serious threats that he's making. But at the same time, the West does the same thing with its nuclear weapons, and we do seem to have a kind of situation where we reassure ourselves that he's not going to use nuclear weapons in the final instance, so we can just carry on supplying weapons or doing whatever we want with Ukraine because we call his bluff and then it disappears. But it doesn't seem to wash to me because we seem to think that bad men are not in the end willing to use nuclear weapons, and yet good men on our side are credibly threatening the use of nuclear weapons. It doesn't add up. And this is part of the core problem of nuclear deterrence. You have to make these threats, but then are you really willing to carry them out? Creates a lot of ambiguity.
Speak to us very quickly as well about what you fear in seeing these types of weapons moved at such a distance closer to Europe's actual borders. Does that concern you?
It does, but it concerns me largely because it is signalling the ongoing commitment and deepening commitment to nuclear deterrence by Russia. On the other hand, he is basically matching NATO's deployments of nuclear weapons that have been in Europe since before the NPT was signed and ratified in 1968. So NATO have been the ones deploying nuclear weapons in non-nuclear weapon states for more than half a century, and Russia believes that it is basically just going along the NATO line, which is why Blinken and the US has been so slow to condemn Russia for these deployments, because basically they're doing the same.
Right. Yauheni, let me turn to you. Explain why. Why does Belarus want nuclear weapons on its own soil? Belarus is not in danger of an attack. So couldn't this just be considered a liability to have these dangerous weapons on your own territory?
Well, when we say that Belarus is not under attack, it's important to give a caveat that we need to understand what exactly this picture of threats, what it looks like to decision makers in Minsk. And honestly, when we see the buildup of conventional capabilities on Belarus' western borders, when we see that NATO is indeed changing its posture in Europe, especially eastwardly, then I think it's clear that for those who make decisions in Minsk, there are quite some threats on the horizon. And what is happening right now, and here I do agree with Paul, it basically mirrors the development we saw in Europe immediately after the beginning of the Cold War. In the early 1950s, when we compared the conventional capabilities between NATO and the Soviet Union and its Central European satellites, then the capabilities looked very much in the Soviets' favor. And it was back then that NATO, the US, and its European allies decided to use nuclear weapons as a deterrent, because conventionally they were inferior to the capabilities and potential of the Soviet army. This is exactly what is going on right now. I can assure you that people in Minsk are not really happy about these developments. Anyone, beginning from the government highest echelon and a common man in the street, but they do consider it as a deterrence mechanism, sort of a last resort, because conventionally they understand they are really inferior to what NATO can offer.
Okay, so you're saying they're not happy about this development, but that they actually believe Belarus is now safer? Belarus is now safer because these weapons are there?
Well, exactly like the 5 European NATO allies, which are part to NATO nuclear sharing arrangements. They all understand that on the one hand, this is a risk because you immediately become a target for the other side's potential strike. But at the same time, this gives you a sense of deterrence. And when those two factors are put in balance, somehow both in those 5 European states, including Turkey, by the way, But also here, in the case of Belarus, decision makers tend to believe that the deterrence effect is stronger than that of a potential additional risk.
Okay. Let me turn to Andrei. And let's be clear as well that these weapons are not being given to Minsk. They're just being stationed in Belarus. And only Russians, as far as we know, will be allowed to control them. So why do you think it's in Lukashenko and Putin's interest to move these weapons there?
Well, let's first set a record straight, because I did expect to hear these views from Minsk, because this gentleman is known to be very strongly pro-Lukashenko and defending the dictator. I wasn't expecting to hear the arguments from Cambridge that Putin is just mirroring the United States and NATO policy in Europe, because look, we have a completely different situation, and try to compare these two situations is to play into the hands of aggressors and dictators. Because the decision to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of Europe in different countries were taken by the sovereign countries, independent countries of NATO. And I was close friends with some of the people that organized the first anti-nukes demonstrations in Europe, in Germany, for example. Millions of people were in the streets, but eventually the decision was taken by the legislative body and approved by the government. And then when Russia became more aggressive, they were recognizing that they were mistaken not to view these weapons as the guarantee of their security. So to compare the two aggressors playing with nuclear weapons with the legitimate decisions in Europe by NATO, but by United States, by independent countries, it's very worrisome.
Because
for
you
me.
do not believe that Belarus is a sovereign and independent country.
I do believe that, first of all, Belarus didn't take any decision. Belarusians are against nuclear weapons. The decisions were taken by the person who is not legitimate, who lost his legitimacy in '96 when he usurped the constitution and the power, and he built the most horrible dictatorship in Europe. And he unleashed the repression never seen in Europe since the World War.
But Andrei,
he had no right to take this decision. And when you say that we're kind of comforted by the belief that Putin will not use it and Lukashenko will not use it, follow his statements. He is so much eager to get these nuclear weapons and to get control of these nuclear weapons. And he was telling about this all the time. And if you believe the lies, then we will have no security.
Okay, but then I'll bring this up with Paul quickly. Paul, I mean, Lukashenko will not have control. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you know something otherwise, and I'll put the same question to Yauheni. These weapons, yes, they're stationed in Belarus, but Russia, from what I'm reading and understanding, is being very careful to make sure that they are strictly in the control of only Russian agents.
Yes, that's correct. And in the American case, that is the case too. Though when there is a declaration of war, the NATO practice is to hand those nuclear weapons over from American personnel to the pilots of the NATO states, and they will be delivered by the host states. So the host states then become nuclear weapon states for all intents and purposes at a point of conflict. I'm not sure if exactly the same arrangements are to be delivered in Belarus, but I'm sure that the Russians will retain control of the nuclear weapons up until at least until the point of decision for release. So this is a Russian Kremlin decision. But what I would add is that Lukashenko's statements are absurd on this. I make no comment on Lukashenko's legitimacy. All I was comparing was the fact that NATO has been deploying, or rather the US has been deploying nuclear weapons in non-nuclear weapon states for more than half a century, and that it was thereby risking global security with exactly this sort of action by adversary states. We incidentally face the same problem potentially with Pakistani nuclear weapons in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the world. We can't have double standards here, and we need to pull those nuclear weapons out of Europe.
Okay.
May I ask a question? Was it done within the framework of international law and in the domestic legislators of the country? I mean, the deployment of nuclear weapons on the territory of NATO countries?
This is controversial, and at every NPT non-proliferation treaty review conference, many non-nuclear weapon states complain about the NATO arrangements. I think we do need consistency here, and we do need to be pulling these weapons back. And I agree that these weapons make Belarus less safe rather than more safe, and they make all of us less safe, and this should not have happened.
Okay. Yauheni, I know you've said that you believe Belarusians feel safer now that these weapons have been moved onto Belarusian territory. But I'd like to hear your understanding of who has full control over these weapons. As Paul was saying, in the case of NATO countries, the control would be handed over to various pilots in various NATO states. Should these weapons need to be deployed and used, hopefully that will never be the case, but in the case of Belarus, from what I'm understanding, the Russians have no plans to let any Belarusian pilots or technicians actually deal with these weapons. And it somehow indicates that there still isn't quite full trust, even though this is Russia's closest ally.
Well, first of all, don't get me wrong. I think with the type of escalation we're having in Europe and at the very heart of Europe, especially here around Belarus, no one is feeling safer. That's why I emphasize it, that according to my observations, neither people in the Belarusian government nor common men or women in the streets feel particularly happy about it. But what also I'm trying to say, and here again, I can agree with Paul, you know, I'm an analyst. I'm not a politician. I don't have a political agenda. And that's why I have a privilege of, you know, working with facts and comparing. So when I look at this case in progress in and around Belarus and compare it to the cases of NATO nuclear sharing arrangements, I don't see a lot of differences in terms of why countries want to deploy nuclear weapons. Because, you know, if their decision makers feel it's safer under a given specific geopolitical condition, which is about escalation. So if they feel it's safer to have a nuclear deterrent working in their favor, then the very same applies here in the case of Belarus. If they feel that it's not enough just to have Article 5, I mean, NATO Article 5 guarantees, and they want American boots on the ground, but also American nukes on the ground. So a similar logic applies here. And I think we need to be consistent if we really want to understand why certain things develop and how to avoid even worse development. And if we don't just focus on, you know, making political statements. Now, as to who controls what, I don't think, you know, we're ever going to learn that in detail because, you know, indeed, countries want to have a certain degree of uncertainty because they think it works sort of in their favor. But also it's, you know, a top secret arrangement. What we know for sure is that Belarus and Russia say they're mirroring the NATO arrangement, which, as Paul said, indeed is about having Russia in full control of the arsenals up until the point when the war breaks out, because it is believed that when the war breaks out, then the NPT does not apply, and they can hand operational commands of those nukes to the Belarusian pilots who have been prepared, and also to Belarusian Iskander-M complexes, which have been also put on service. And in this respect, I don't think we see any indications that there is a lot of distrust between Belarus and Russia. I think we just observe a situation where they need to somehow not get into trouble because of the NPT. And again, exactly like the Americans and their European allies have been doing for 5 decades.
Okay. Andrei, let me ask you, now that we have the war in Ukraine well into its second year, as I said, now this increased cooperation between Russia and Belarus and hosting nuclear weapons together, closer than ever to European borders, where does this actually leave Belarus's opposition movement that was at one time so significant in the country? I mean, does this knock you almost entirely out of the equation now because of the consequences of the war in Ukraine and this movement of nuclear weapons?
Well, it leaves Belarus in a position in prisons. We have more than 8,000 political prisoners in Belarus, and the the real leaders of the Belarusian opposition are all in prison, are all beaten, are all tortured, and the West unable to tackle several problems at a time, and Ukrainian war overshadows this humanitarian catastrophe and the crime against humanity that is going on in Belarus. So, and it is quite annoying to hear all-time very feeble reaction to the dangerous developments in this region, which are provoked by Putin and Lukashenko, and this expression of consensus, deep consensus, serious consensus, led us to the war. And when the nuclear weapons are being moved very close to the European borders, again we hear that it is no concern, and we're following the situation. We don't intend to change our nuclear posture. It's not reassuring. We at least want to hear what could be done and what United States and NATO would not do. Because every time the reaction is this, we will not do this, we will not do that. We need to know because it is absolutely against the will of Belarusian people that Lukashenko is taking part in this war. It's absolutely against the will of Belarusian people that he is doing today everything to help Putin to kill peaceful Ukrainians, innocent citizens. So I think that the reaction is inadequate in my view.
Okay. I mean, and Paul, I saw you nod your head.
That is why it weakens, of course, the position of Belarusian opposition.
I saw Paul nod his head in agreement there when you spoke of the feeble reaction. And Paul, ultimately in this question for you and Yauheni both, is this escalating to the point that, Putin might just refuse to lose? He's said there will be no winners in the case of a third world war. I mean, is he just potentially ready to take everyone down with him? And this escalation with nuclear weapons could be indicating that?
Well, I think that anybody that gives a clear answer to your question there is guessing, and the consequences of it going wrong are so massive that it is deeply irresponsible for people to answer that question with any confidence. And that's the message that we're getting from so many analysts in Washington and many European capitals is we don't need to worry. Putin has made threats in the past over the last few months, and they have come to nothing. And so he won't use them in future. And this is what I was talking about. I mean, is Putin to be really trusted with nuclear weapons? Is Putin the sort of man that we can go, that we can assume will hold back in the final assessment and allow his regime to fall, which I think is a serious probability if he loses this war? Or is he the person willing to press the button? None of us know, and the consequences are massive. So we have to treat this threat seriously, but treating the threat seriously is not simply matching him nuke threat by nuke threat, which is not what the Americans are doing. It's not what I think they should be doing, but what they should be doing is learning the lessons that they can't operate with an exceptionalism and expect Russia and other adversaries to just put up with it indefinitely.
Yauheni, go ahead.
Well, I'm on the very same page. I mean, unfortunately, there is no ideal scenario out of this war and the broader geopolitical confrontation. It is highly irresponsible and really dangerous for a lot of analysts and even politicians, like Paul said, to basically make this case that, no matter what Putin says, we just need to push on and on. The problem is that we don't even need to guess whether he's going to use it. We need to be aware of the fact that when someone is cornered, then there is only one way out of that corner. And if that someone is the leader of a nation which holds the biggest nuclear arsenal, I'm afraid, this already tells us something about the possibility of this one way out. And I'm not sure we want to test that. So I'd rather, start thinking about a serious negotiation process, no matter how difficult it might sound or even, unacceptable for a lot of parties right now, because unfortunately there is no other better solution, including for the West. So only in talks can we come about something which will at least ensure that the humanity stays alive.
Okay. Andrei, less than a minute left. Are talks the only answer? Does Putin have to be negotiated with? Does Ukraine have to make compromises? Period.
No, it's not a solution. I think that what could be a solution, the closing the sky over the Ukraine and preparing the measures in response to a potential nuclear threat and activating Budapest Memorandum, because the last sentence of the last provision of the Budapest Memorandum says that if there is a threat of nuclear usage of nuclear weapons, there have to be at least consultations. And I must remind you that in the largest military exercise after the collapse of the Soviet Union that were held on the territory of Belarus, Zapad 2009, the scenario of nuclear strike on Warsaw was in the play, was activated, yeah? And the tank marched towards through Suwalki Gap towards Kaliningrad to cut off the Baltic states from the rest of Europe.
Okay.
So the usage of nuclear weapons was already at the table 14 years ago.
Okay, Andrei, that will have to be the final word. Very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for joining us, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrei Sannikov. We will see you next time.